Morrow of the Golden Age, Chapter 32. The narrow, oftentimes overgrown and faint road to Noreia curves suddenly upwards from the plains around Eltenham, beginning its long ascent towards the Highland chiefdoms. At the first foothills, the road is flanked on either side by jagged bluffs and steep embankments that command the flat ground before them. From here, the Bosporans watched as the Roman camp crept over the horizon. Indeed, it was the camp that was visible first, advancing post by post as the legions filed in and dutifully built their lodgings at night. This was something the Romans excelled at, always creating complex camps with tall walls in the time between sundown and dark. But this camp in particular was grand, and seemed to continue its journey towards the Bosporans even in the night, for more and more men continued to arrive. So it was that on a bright morning in the eves of summer in 148 prior, two huge armies faced off across the 5 stadies of open ground between them. Although it was not truly open, for the Bosporans had placed their own camps directly in front of their positions, one on either side of the road, each fronting the hills and heights they occupied. This placement was to entice the Romans forward, and furthermore to demonstrate the willingness of the invaders to camp on the Roman side of the mountains. It also provided a use that the Lithosis likely encouraged. It broke up the open battlefield so that some parts were not visible to others. This was the kind of situation the forest folk adored, although in truth few forest Lithosis were present at this grand battle, since most of the natives of the forest had returned there after the Seleucid War. Yet Doreius commanded some 2,000 riders all the same, mainly steppe folk who had been brought up after the Lithosis revival in the First Lands, such that their skills on horseback and knowledge of worldly purpose were almost as sublime as those dwelling in the hidden cities of the Deepwood. Let us speak of the Romans. They came with 7 legions of men, numbering perhaps 40,000 in all. However, they did not all come at once, because after waiting for months to attack the Bosporans, they did so in a hurry to appease their politicians. The vanguard consisted of the venerated First Legion, the Romans' picked men, according to some, and a ceremonial force at best according to others. This force did not get any chance to demonstrate its skill. Several days before the battle at hand, this vanguard had actually passed between the Bosporan camps, thinking they were abandoned because no fires were shown. Such was Doreius' policy in this dangerous situation, and at dawn the whole army pounced on the Romans still in their marching column. This vanguard was completely destroyed, being too heavily laden and exhausted to send even a single messenger for aid, let alone actually fight. Doreius refused their surrender, for he had use for them in death. A few days later the aforementioned camp came, and with it first the 20th Legion under one Flavius Plautus. He marched his infantrymen towards the Lithosis camp in the east, ignoring the Gold Guard camp under Zeuxis in the west. This was a wily choice, for attacking the west camp would have made a supporting attack by the swift riders from the east simple, but the encumbered Gold Guard could not do the same in turn from the west. Therefore, Doreius went forward from the hills to delay the ongoing column, while Zeuxis took his army on foot across the road, racing to establish themselves on the hills the Lithosis had left. Here the fight began in earnest. Since this clash lasted for many days, I will begin by describing the first day in full detail, and then highlight where the action of subsequent days shared the qualities of the first, at risk of diminishing the scale of this clash for the reward of not repeating myself too tediously. The Romans of the 20th Legion, bolstered by their knowledge that tens of thousands more soldiers were following behind them, advanced quickly and without good formation. They aimed to establish themselves between the Gold Guard and the eastern hills by racing up the road, also bypassing the Lithosis camp. However, the Lithosis were, of course, quicker to deploy on the road and force battle, doing so primarily from the west, so that they were in contact along the whole length of the Roman column. The mounted riders were free to run up to the Roman lines and release their arrows because the Romans did not have any bows or slings between them, as was the narrow-sighted Roman way. In fact, they barely had horses, so strong was their belief in the use of footmen with great shields. Since heavy infantry can't easily escape a battle, they make good captive soldiers for ruthless commanders. The infantry tried to ignore the horsemen and carry on marching between the road and the Lithosis camp, heading straight for the hills. With their layers of protectives, it was true that arrows were not very likely to harm them. Yet nor were they benign, and there was, it seemed, no end to the hail of arrows the Bosporans could offer, because the riders had their spare horses laden with additional missiles. The Romans had given this army months of time to prepare, so arrows were as common on this battlefield as blades of grass. Perhaps the Romans cursed themselves for not bringing a single bow to repurpose the supply of arrows digging into their shields, armor, and sometimes flesh. Like a man who was made to swerve into the shadow of a tree by the violence of a storm, the Roman column was pushed from the road and towards the Lithoses camp. Seeing that said camp was not protected by gates or watchtowers, it must have seemed a natural course to head inside to find relief. Most of the legion ran inside, the Lithosis riders trotting closer to carry on shooting all the while. At the camp, the Romans saw what had happened to the first legion. Each palisade post ringing the camp was actually a grave post, with a helmet and shield lain at its base, and Golden Age runes painted in blood running up each post. Aside from this, the camp was sparse. The men had thought of looting what they could, but by Doreius' design, the only loot to be had was from the graves of their comrades. Seeing the camp had fallen, the 18th and 19th legions veered from the road and made straight for the camp from the south, unimpeded by the Bosporans. During this time, the 20th Legion had been trying to go out to the north, towards the hills, as per their original orders. This was impossible, since now the Lithoses were hammering the exits with arrows as soon as anyone approached. The two fresh legions squeezed into the camp, leaving hardly enough room for everyone within the protection of the grave palisades. It must have seemed absurd to the new arrivals that forward progress was so difficult, and yet all that went to try their luck at an advance north were met with the same wind of arrows. The Romans did not enjoy seeing their soldiers dying on the one hand, and cowering behind the graves of those who died before on the other. Conversely, Doreius and his riders enjoyed this sight immensely. So did Zeuxis, who had used the long delay at the camp to occupy the commanding heights close by, robbing the Romans of their quarry. The Romans were left with several burdensome choices. Staying in the camp was a miserable prospect, although perhaps the safest, since they might engineer the graves into a more crafty stockade and resist the Bosporans' sniping with ease. However, they hated the sight of the Bosporans on the hill so hotly that they were also wont to drive out with their full force and seize that position. Lastly, they might simply return to their camp in careful order, knowing that their advantage in numbers and equipment would prevent any serious threat of chase and rout. Evidently, the qualities of these three stratagems varied from moment to moment and from commander to commander. There were three commanders present: Plautus, Salinator, and Ambustus, who were supposed to serve between Antonitus of the 1st Legion, whose remains were interred beneath a flag post marking the centre of the squatters' camp. Each man began to lead their own soldiers on separate raids and sorties to go out of the camp and try to defeat a portion of the Lithoses, who for their part had established themselves thinly in every direction. However, when attacks were made, the riders would come together at the point of attack like flies descending on a cow emerging from a stable door. Invariably, these attacks were beaten back. Every time there would be some soldiers who strayed away from the formation, only to be struck by sudden charges from the maelstrom of horses circling them. There were limited attempts to surrender, but Doreius did not permit it, because there was no method to take and guard captives while more Roman legions were yet approaching. Therefore the slaughter heightened, and those who made it back to the palisades perhaps understood what had been the final fate of all the men those posts memorialized. The Romans were so utterly helpless against the Lithoses because the Roman army had only a few riders of its own. That is not to say there were none. The Romans often deployed young nobles on horseback. However, these nobles were often newcomers to the saddle, being generally averse to exhausting themselves with training. Therefore, in cases where groups of mounted men tried to break out, they became entangled with the more nimble Lithoses formations. In this way, the entire cavalry force that accompanied the legions was lost in the earlier phases of the back-and-forth skirmishing, only cementing the infantry into their peril. At midday, there was an apparent consensus among the Romans that they should return to their camp. The Lithoses had departed briefly to fetch additional supplies, leaving a narrow avenue of opportunity. Hence, the Romans formed 2 orderly columns and began their march southwards, carrying with them various minor prizes taken from the Lithoses camp for the purpose of forging an impression of victory. They were struck back to stillness though when they realized that the Lithoses had actually gone to the Roman camp and taken large numbers of captives from the camp followers. Doreius had ordered them to look for evidence that more legions would come to battle, and indeed they brought back reports of movement in the rearmost camps. This was probably from the arrival of the rest of the Roman army. In the moment, their galloping to return to the battle drove the frontmost legions back into the Lithoses camp in panic. Likely realizing they would not be able to call for aid, the Roman generals carried the momentum of their returning march and proceeded northwards towards the Bosporan main line. This line had been lazing about on the hillside, hardly in formation, because Prince Zeuxis wanted to inspire foolish courage in the enemy with such a lax display. Furthermore, the advantages of being rested and fed are obvious, especially when your army has been on the march and under stress continuously before the fighting was even joined. Such was the battle that now came. The Romans were drawn out in the space between the grave camp and the hill because they were afraid of who would come from the flanks or behind. Once their leading elements were at the hill's base, Zeuxis had his Gold Guard establish a shield wall on all the best tracks to the summit, and brought forward Daxian, Hermanian and Scythian men armed with bows and javelins to terrorize anyone who began to climb up. The courage of the Romans proved mixed, with some companies being driven back and others relying on their tall shields and armor to weather the storm. A few hundred were able to make contact with the Gold Guard. Recall that in fights like these, both sides were trained in the same deadly art of close-quarters butchery with short swords. This is a strenuous business, and this left the Gold Guard in command of not only high ground, but high alacrity for talented bouts on account of their freshness. The Romans had not fought with men who were as well provided for as themselves, counting all their prior victories against foes who were not aware of very much military academia. To encounter a firmly placed wall of highly trained killers was an experience they reserved for their foes, rendering the current predicament utterly chilling, not because it was novel and unseen, but precisely because they had seen it before countless times from the other side. Seeing the attack faltering, the Roman generals came up and tried to inspire their men with passionate pleas. After they too were harassed with arrows, they submitted to reality and ordered a retreat. Those too closely engaged to retreat were left to fight under their lesser officers, who saw themselves surrounded by the returning Lithoses or surging Bosporan infantry, most of whom were yet to fight and came out eagerly. Hundreds of the best Roman men were thus killed on the high ground for all their comrades to see as they trudged back to the grave camp, if they had time to make such observations between the resumed volleys of arrows from the Lithoses bands prowling all over the field and even the camp itself. After this, the Romans tried to barricade themselves in the grave camp, but found that the palisades were too firmly held in place to be moved. Such is the strength of a properly made foundation of human power mixed into the world. The rest of the day was passed with the Romans held under siege by the Lithoses, unable to see their own camp to look for aid, and in fact only able to see the Bosporans on the heights resuming their infuriating afternoon of leisure, replete with captured Roman arms and garbs. In the evening, the Romans finally made concerted effort to retreat. Seeing that the Roman camp in the distance had been fully occupied by fresh banners, Doreius did not allow pursuit. Instead, he had his infantry rebuild the Lithoses camp so rest could be had, and the horses were taken to graze further north, out of the enemy's sight. The first day of the battle was over. The Romans had lost 7,000 of their most experienced soldiers, around half the number present on the field. The Bosporans had lost only 200 men between both armies. Against an ordinary foe, this day of valiant effort and victory would be enough to end a war. Here, though, it was merely one head of the Hydra. After a night of pain and regret, the Romans came out of their camp again on the second day. Now they had the fully manned 12th Legion under Servius Rufus marching in the vanguard, and the 18th Legion under Gaius Ambustus in mostly good condition in the centre, and the combined remnants of the 19th and 20th under Flavius Plautus as a rearguard. As on the previous day, the Leuthosis streamed out of their camp and assembled behind it. Seeing this, the Romans surged forward to take said camp, their vanguard not dissuaded by whatever survivors of the previous day had told them about such a strategy. As readily as a man cups his hands to catch a stone he has tossed into the air, King Doreius let his riders loose to surround the Roman vanguard. Perhaps General Rufus was wiser than his predecessors, for he ordered an immediate withdrawal when he saw the cavalry on the move. Even though hundreds of Romans were caught in their attempts to leave, the majority of the force escaped and linked up with the other legions. The Leuthosis formed two lines on either side of their camp, and crucially not within it. This was an unusual formation that implied their number was greater than it really was, as reasonable onlookers might assume that the portion of their line obscured by palisades was similarly manned to the visible parts. And beyond that further still, the movement of the Bosporan infantry was concealed entirely. They had been marching forward on the road to join the battle, and only now, after the Roman chance to rush for the heights had been squandered, did the Gold Guard begin climbing those heights to resume their overlook of the previous day. Now a familiar pattern repeated. The Romans advanced and found the camp was easy to take, but there was little use for an increasingly well-stocked museum of the Roman dead. The Roman horsemen were able to rush into battle and trade blows with the Leuthosis up close. The men were eager and able, yet so few in number that their courage can only be called outrageous, and perhaps even impossible to explain without resorting to assuming will was being provided to them by the gods as a punishment. When the infantry came forward to challenge for battle, the Leuthosis simply withdrew and continuously shot at anyone who went after them. In this way, the Romans secured the contested fields to the flanks of the camp, then despaired at how they could go nowhere without being attacked, except for back into the camp itself. And so the entire force of 4 legions was forced into the pen the Leuthosis had prepared, whereupon it was hard for them to sally out, and easy for the Leuthosis to loose arrows inward. Many sallies were attempted, and like on the first day, there were some pushes that even challenged the Gold Guard on the heights. But always the danger was too great, the Bosporan flanks too bustling with aggressive sweeps of horse, and the fortified Roman camp far to the rear calling out as the only pale of safety. By evening, around half of the Romans were dead or too wounded to escape. The rest finally were given leave to return. They might have expected the Bosporans to let them go, as they had on the first day. Nay, now King Doreius had no reason to hold back, and he permitted a slaughterous pursuit by all his forces. The quaking of the ground beneath the Bosporan advance turned the Romans to full flight, throwing away their shields and mail to have any hope of reaching their walls. This did not help them. The Leuthosis swept into their path and wove through the dissolving Roman columns with skillful flair. Arrows and spears did cruel work, and Doreius went forth with his royal guard to seek the standard of Servius Rufus. Rufus halted and offered a parley, to which Doreius replied only with swordwork. Rufus's head was taken by the king's own hand, and no man beneath him fared any better. 8,000 men were killed in this rout, adding to the 4,000 who had been killed or taken captive during the day. The Bosporans had 400 wounded men in total, all of whom survived, and the same number of wounded horses, who were healed or let go in the wild later. The Roman camp was spared a night raid by virtue of it appearing to be fully garrisoned, even now, and this was something the Leuthosis were convinced was a mere ruse, since using standards and fire to bluff was a well-known military technique. However, in this instance, the Romans were good on their word. The rear legions had filtered up to occupy the foremost camps, burning the rear camps as they went. The smoke blew over the battlefield and angered the Leuthosis horses, dampening the Bosporans' momentum yet further. After surveying the scene, Doreius ordered everyone back to their respective camps, again forced to reconstitute the Leuthosis camp after the Romans had ruined it. It was also planned to expand it, however there was no time to collect materials because of what happened next. On the third day, the battlefield was seeded with thousands of dead Romans. The weapons they had discarded were being casually collected by the Bosporan light troops and loaded into wagons, when horns sounded from the south. The gates of the Roman camp opened, and it seemed that Rome, in its unfamiliarity with defeat, did not know that to come again into the maw of disaster was like quenching one's thirst by jumping into the outer sea. They were likely spurred on by the knowledge that the soldiers on this third day were not Roman enough to matter. They were the 11th Legion, who were supposedly those men from Gallia and the coasts of the Outer Sea who sided with the late Gaius Caesar in the extermination of their compatriots. In truth, said men were beyond fighting age, and this new formation was taken from their descendants in some cases and from Gallic slaves in others. They fought in their famous steel mail and wielded tall shields, making them comparable to the usual troops the Romans employed. Only they were not equal citizens, and thus had dramatically reduced interests in the fate of their overlords. This group was divided into two contingents, intended to attack both Bosporan camps at once. The eastern attack went far to the flanks of the battlefield and approached along the line of the valuable embankments. Clearly, these Gallians knew something about warfare. Meanwhile, the western attack cut forwards quickly to separate the Gold Guard from the Lithosis and delay their deployment, simultaneously threatening the Lithosis rear as the riders came out of the camp to challenge the eastern push. The eastern strike seized the key heights, but noted that the western group had become embroiled with the Greek cavalry attached to the Gold Guard, such that the heavy infantrymen of said formation were creeping along the ridgeline unassailed. Furthermore, the Lithosis on the flats nearby had no trouble shooting up at the Gallians on the heights. Seeing this, the Gallians tried to charge down, using large trumpets and angry cries in what was likely an attempt to frighten the horses. Yet steppe warhorses are extremely bold, being from long lines of tested pedigree, so no effect was granted. Instead, the Gallians in the east were filled with arrows and charged at close quarters. These footmen lacked spears because they had been instructed to fight in the Roman style, yet lacked the strict training to cover up the weaknesses of this format. 1,000 men were killed, and the rest quit the battle, after which the Lithosis could turn their attention to the western group. Said group, under one Praetor Albus, saw that they had failed to stall the Gold Guard for very long, and that they were about to be surrounded. They fell back into their approaching rearguard. Then together, this group steered into the communal cemetery of all Roman soldiers that was the twice rebuilt Lithosis camp. They were rested and saw the Gold Guard settle down on the high ground. This time Doreius held his Lithosis back and did not harry the enemy, because he did not want to break their nerve too quickly. Rather, he preferred for them to actually arrange for formal battle, so that they could be defeated altogether. He ordered the horsemen to wait in the wings, and invited the enemy to test the Gold Guard on the heights, giving plenty of space to create a formation on the nearby field. The Roman auxiliaries took this offer and made their lines in front of the Lithosis camp, as if it was their own. The inclusion of the rearguard had added some true Roman soldiers to the mix, as well as levied peoples from Greece and Macedonia. They had 3 men for every 2 on the Bosporan side, although the quality of those men was variable, so it is not as if the Bosporans had a disadvantage. Such things were beyond Roman sight, because their leaders were adamant that they would win if they could only achieve a real battle. Hence a steady advance upon the Gold Guard was signalled, and on the enemy came to a dire place of impending terror. When the lines were close, the Greek men under the Roman banners began slinging stones up the hill. But the Gold Guard parted their shields to let the Scythians shoot down with their heavy bows, driving the Greeks back. Then there were the Macedonians, who had been creeping close to throw javelins. They were mauled and panicked by javelins instead thrown by the Bosporans, because the Gold Guard had adopted the Roman tradition of having all soldiers carry 1 or 2 javelins for use at the opening of a clash. Finally, the main body of armoured infantry roared out their battle cry and assailed the hill, Albus whipping at their behinds. In return, the Gold Guard made a show of all drawing their swords in tandem and holding them with the face of the blade pointed towards the enemy, so that the steel gleamed in the midday sun upon that south-facing slope. Then they sang a war verse in the Lithosis tongue, with their shields tilted so as to funnel the force of the sound towards the Gallians. The lines were, "Good warriors, you face our test of skill. Those who shine shall not be killed. Reach the cosmos and serve our cause, or perish as fruit of worldly laws." Battered by the sound of this heavenly command, which was repeated a few times, the Gallians clustered together in their centre, distending the flanks fearfully. Then the Gold Guard at last charged in unison, their swords beaming above them, sweeping down the hill as a dark wave of death. The Gold Guard, despite the name, generally had their shields and armour painted with dried blood, which was a deep hue of red approaching brown or black. Not a single galleon was still facing forwards by the time the Bosporans reached them, and the butchery was total. Praetor Albus and a few riders attempted to flee, yet the Lithosis had already set out on faster horses to screen the rear section and prevent any such move. Therefore, of the men still on the battlefield at this time, not one was able to escape alive. To the Romans, what was the purpose of this hopeless attack? It was to prepare another, for by keeping the Bosporans at a distance for one more day, they were able to organize their 2 remaining legions of superior troops. Yes, despite all I have said, the Romans had some 7,000 men still not committed, and some amount more left over from previous battles that is hard to estimate, but likely did not exceed 1,000. On the Bosporan side, the number of Lithosis riders had to be reduced, because now even the spare horses were absolutely exhausted or too injured to use, reducing the effective count to perhaps 1,000. The Gold Guard, on the other hand, were at full strength, and were even being reinforced day by day, since new recruits were being sent forward from the Bosporan garrison at Noreia as soon as they were available, arriving in groups of 100 each day. Numbering around 4,000 now, recall that half of their total number were in Illyria, I think it might finally be said that the balance of forces on either side had been equalized. Given what we have seen so far, a fair engagement bodes very poorly for those Romans still to take their turn in battle. Naturally, I must now describe the 4th day. At dawn, the 13th Legion was spotted approaching from the east, following the good example of the Gallians, whose many bodies they had to pass on the way. Because it was the case that either side might claim the heights, and Doreius did not want to have to contend with an enemy at height for the sake of the horses, the Bosporans on this occasion did not attempt to use the advantages of the terrain. Rather, they stood in open battle formation on the road, reminding the Romans that no matter what they did, this was the road into their empire, and it was an insult to their perilous gods and yet more perilous state to have a foreign army sunning itself on the road unmolested. Inevitably, the Romans diverted their course and came to line up in front of the Bosporans. The Bosporans were content to do nothing, because the Lithosis were coursing around the area, ensuring that the rest of the Romans were still guarding the camp, and once satisfied of this, they were taking up positions of malice in all directions around the impending battlefield. By the time the Roman troops were stepping into their final advance, they could not have missed that they were surrounded on 3 sides, albeit loosely and at a polite distance. Now there was a meeting of shields as the heavy infantrymen on both sides got to grips with each other. The Roman soldiers of the 13th Legion, and indeed the 14th manning the ramparts of the camp, were what the Italians call Zeuxis, which might roughly be interpreted to mean people, but more accurately means other people. This is because the Romans had a pompous attitude to citizenship that precluded them from letting even those who had lived in their lands for centuries and fought as their closest companions from actually being called Roman, for that status was reserved for the natives of the city itself and a few select colonies. Therefore, even the lowest man of Rome was Roman, and the highest elites of other Italian cities were mere allies, relegated to a lower rank in military affairs. So these armies we speak of now were those components of the Roman military, being raised from Italian cities not fitting of the Roman legacy. That is to their credit, I say, for who would wish the Roman legacy upon their friends? The Zeuxis were trained and armed in the same way as true Romans, although they were aware that they were being committed to battle as a last resort, having been fully privy to the defeats of the previous days. Their only hope was that said defeats had drained the Bosporans to the point of near defeat themselves, and once the fighting began, they saw that this was not at all true. As you must have expected by now, the Lithosis closed in and began to shoot at the Romans from all sides, forcing the Roman formation to peel back at its flanks to protect itself, in turn letting the Gold Guard press forwards and cut into the emerging gaps with ease. Seeing that the situation was hopeless, their leader, Coelho, ordered a return to the camp, from which the 14th Legion was emerging now to provide aid. Seeing this, Doreius recalled his men and let a sizable amount of the Romans leave. His goal was to prevent them from being so wounded that they would refuse to come out of their camp again, and hence prolong the battle further. In addition, little did the Romans know, the Lethoses were finally reaching the dregs of their prepared supplies of arrows, making the Bosporan army unsuited to assaulting manned walls. In all, the fourth day was the least destructive of the lot, seeing only around 1,000 Romans killed, although this did include all of the 13th Legion's horsemen and many officers. Doreius got his wish when the fifth day came, because at last the Romans rounded up their entire force and abandoned their camp, committing everything to battle. This force was perhaps 5,000 strong, although witnesses of the day claim that some were camp followers and slaves given armour and made to fill out the middle ranks of the formation. The Bosporans did not empty their camps in return because the Lethoses were without horses and arrows, so they barricaded themselves inside and deployed only a few hundred riders to open battle. The Gold Guard sent out 3,000 men, 1,000 of which were light troops and 2,000 the Guard proper. Their Greek horsemen were dispatched to investigate the Roman camp and were not present for the battle. This final day of fighting proceeded in the ordinary way. The armies lined up on the open ground astride the road, and for the first time sent men forward to negotiate. Doreius tasked Zeuxis with this, and his famous act was to stand on a cart and simply sweep his hand over the battlefield, then glare at the Roman delegation. This message was simple. What had occurred already says more than he ever could. The Romans did not have any answer, other than to claim impropriety on the Bosporan part and insist that their struggle was more just for it. Then the Roman envoys returned to their lines. Zeuxis stood still, which was usually a sign that more could be said. However, he simply snapped his fingers and let the Romans witness the resplendent shield line of the Gold Guard sweep in and claim the ground the Romans had stood upon. "If you can't kill me, there's no use walking away, friends," Zeuxis called out, and the Bosporans laughed uproariously. Zeuxis was paraded about on the shoulders of his bodyguards in a childish fashion, drawing cheers, and the men mocked the Romans by throwing captured helmets into the air. The Romans were quite ashamed, but in the Roman way whereby the only recourse was violence against others. Thus the Romans, composed mostly of Zeuxis again, came forth for battle along the Bosporan line. This time they were spared much harassing on the flanks by the horsemen, and it was more a test of martial skill on the part of the individual soldiers. This prospect enlivened the Romans, who were finally permitted to fight as they had been trained and accustomed. Yet their opponents were those who had the same advantage, bolstered to greater heights by constant victories and a passion for the fate of man. This was compounded by a growing numerical advantage, as in the throes of the utterly violent and practically uncivilized kind of fighting that arose, the Bosporans saw perhaps one of their number fall for every 5 of the attackers. Once a cursory attempt at threatening the flanks and rear was made, the last peak of Roman bravado was harpooned and dragged back into the ugly mix of reality, whereupon to flee the battle was the only hope of receiving mercy, and a slim hope still. There was no further restraint or tactical caution on the part of the Bosporans, for it had been reliably spied that the Roman camp was no longer guarded. Thus, the mass of men on the battlefield all flowed towards the expansive forts and neat rows of tents that some 40,000 Romans had left empty. Here was victory in its full measure, and it was almost comical that a Bosporan army of a few thousand was ransacking a camp so large and confidently emplaced. The Romans who made it inside first did not stay, and the cause of the Roman Empire as a whole was best represented by the smoke beginning to rise over that city of wood and canvas. Prizes were taken worthy of the 5 days of effort, and hence no man who saw action would ever hunger, even if their king did not provide for them. On the eve of this day, great ceremonial dances were arranged. The grave camp of the Lethoses was fully repurposed into a sprawling pyre, practically a temple in its complexity and scope. It wasn't until dawn was close that the draining of blood was completed. From the heights, this looked like a huge boil upon the land, and indeed that observation is apt, for this pyre was to have the same purging qualities. With the rising sun, the blaze was set, and the Leviathan column of smoke resonated with song so robustly that it is said that the Roman Senate was awoken by hymns of a new age that shook them to their bones. Doreius went among the jubilants and thanked his men for their efforts, partaking in captured wine and overseeing pledges by those who wished to thank whichever gods they thought were their patrons. He did not concern himself with military matters, for the blinding light of his victory pyre had any would-be enemies chasing their shadows into the far distance. The Roman cause had been shattered convincingly, with 9 senior and 15 junior members of their Senate killed in battle, and the extreme majority of their experienced soldiers thrown away, unable to face the one challenge they should have known was always going to befall them. Let us say 2 things of what happened in the aftermath of this battle, as prelude to the crashing wave of changes that came to the world. First, because the Zeuxis had properly seen to a ceremony of restoration for the dead, the large number of valorous lives being returned to the earth shocked the spirit of Taurus into awakening, and deeper inside Taurus, the power of the whole tripartite stirred. We know this because the battlefield today is nowhere to be found. Indeed, the ancient power of building a world apart from the cosmos with the strength of human magic was truly revived. If you go to the place of the battle today, you will find that rushes of water from the mountains have long since cleansed the region of violence, and in its place there is a small mountain named simply New Mountain. This mountain rose up from the ground over a period of some 20 years after the battle, pushing all the earth around it away so that no land was consumed by its coming, only new land was made. There is a temple there where you can learn even more about the Battle of New Mountain than I have told you here, although I do recall that upon my prior visit there I was subjected to many tales I was certain are untrue. Yet I shall not injure their efforts to celebrate a good thing. The second principal effect was upon witness Aeneas, the senior witness of the so-called quincunx then, although in truth minor posts were arguably being given witness-like powers to avoid chaos during the war. The proper death of so many skilled soldiers only contributed more worthy spirits to Aeneas's vessel of paragons, such that he became absolutely inhuman by the 5th day. Remember, he was far away in Macedonia, so it was only later that his men realized why he appeared to have become rabidly senile all of a sudden. The night came with thunder and impossible lights hanging high in the air, unlike ordinary lightning. Aeneas became a beast of a man, smashing his quarters at Serdica's sacred compound and cursing all the gods. So many names did he swear against that no one had heard of them all, and surely some were names no one had ever heard. Any attempts to speak with Aeneas produced only bawling and contradictory bouts of praise and bile, and so soon all attempts to intervene ceased. When the thunder was at its peak and the rain began to batter the city, harder than ever recorded, witness Aeneas fell quiet. Those with him say that he was there one moment and gone the next, divided by a flash of light in the sky. This, most will agree, was the first rugged transition from mankind to paragon that has been recorded in our era, incomplete and poorly orchestrated though it might have been. Aeneas was gone, and I think also were all the other great warriors who were infesting him that night. But the word gone here should not be taken to refer to death. You are wise enough by now that I hardly need clarify this. It was a departure from one place to another, and in that other place, invisibly distant but undeniably strung above us in the heavens, those new paragons met those of old amid the flashing thunder, and, we hope, began to entreat an alliance between human gods and half-men that will channel all the heroes of the modern age to their rightful place in the final execution of our destiny. Such was all that happened between the dawns of the 1st and 6th days of the legendary Battle of Empires, and I hope it will be no surprise for you to learn that the Bosporan cause was set to advance in bounds from here, and this was with certain measures still unplayed. So then next I will recount the happy tale of how the Bosporans turned the shock of this overwhelming victory into something of substance, echoing the chorus of their ascent from the grey seas of the north to the golden deserts of the south. I have no doubt you have heard this part of the story before, but there is no limit to the joy of hearing it again, for here is when we can remove all doubt from our minds that a golden age is in our destiny.